Now, our next session will make you rethink conventional wisdoms. The title is Spheres of Influence in the Age of Unpeace. Today's spheres of influence, you might argue, aren't measured the way they were traditionally, by political and military clout alone. So what constitutes today's spheres of influence in our rapidly changing world? It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome to the stage our panelists, Hina Rabbani Khar, member of the National Assembly of Pakistan and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Pakistan, Borge Brende, President of the World Economic Forum, Ivan Korkok, Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of the Slovak Republic, and our moderator, Mark Leonard.
My name's Mark Leonard. I'm the Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm really excited about this panel where we're going to take a step back from some of the more immediate crises, the wars in Ukraine and Syria, the JCPOA, to think a little bit more about the world order which is being produced by these crises, but which is also shaping them. During my lifetime, there have been two defining ways of thinking about global order. Some people thought we were moving towards one world, building interdependence between countries through a global trading and finance system, supply chains, the internet. And others argued that great power competition would be the defining force, with the biggest countries building spheres of influence around each other, competing for power and glory. And many people wondered who would be proven right after the end of the Cold War, and it turned out that both were. We have unprecedented levels of interdependence and enormous competition. And the result is what I call the age of unpeace, where the ties that bind us can both create extraordinary possibilities for cooperation and wealth, but can also be turned into weapons in an unending competition. And the metaphor that I use to explain it is that geopolitics has become like a loveless marriage where the couple can't get divorced. And just in a marriage that's falling apart, it's the things which brought us together in the good times that become the ways that we hurt each other in the bad times. In a marriage, it's about who gets the holiday home, the pet dog, custody of the children. But in geopolitics, it's about supply chains, about our trading relationships, about our finance system, about our energy links, about the internet. And what we're finding is that all of these things are being weaponized. And even if you take something which looks like the most traditional, old-fashioned, heart-rending conflict like the war in Ukraine, you can see that behind the tanks and the shells, there is an even more troubling struggle going on that involves parties that are not separated by an iron curtain, but are deeply bound up with each other's affairs, and that are using a lot of these ties that bind to play out the competition between one another. So on the one side, you have manipulation of energy supplies, you have forced waves of migration, you have cyber attacks, and on the others, the most ambitious program of financial sanctions, barriers put on sharing technology, information campaigns being waged in different parts of the world. And I think what this shows is that the distinction between war and peace, which was so devastatingly apparent in the 19th and 20th centuries, is now breaking down. And we're seeing these new battlefields emerging, from trade to migration, with each state promoting its own version of a sphere of influence within it. And I argue in a book I've just written that this is going to create a perpetual age of unpeace. And we couldn't have a more interesting group of speakers to help us try and make sense of this world than the people we have on the panel today. To my left, is Hina Rabbani Khar. She was Foreign Minister of Pakistan, but she's also, I think, one of the smartest analysts of the world that we live in, as well as practitioners that I've ever met. To my immediate right, we have Boje Brende, who's president of the World Economic Forum, also a former foreign minister of his country, Norway, and I think he's thought more about how geopolitics, the global economy, energy, technology fit together, and what that means for world order than almost anyone I know. And finally, we have Ivan Kochok, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, still Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Slovak Republic. And he's somebody who's really living on the front line of the crisis in Ukraine. I think there have been almost 270,000 refugees welcomed in your country, which is, I think, almost 5% of your population. So it will be the same as 16 million people showing up in the United States of America. I asked all of the panelists to tell us very briefly what they think the sort of longer-term consequences, both of the war in Ukraine are, and also what the Western and international response through sanctions, through energy diversification and other measures is going to mean for our world order. And then we'll go into a bit more detail afterwards. So maybe you could go first, Minister.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning to all of you. Before I start, I'd like to thank very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in this prestigious forum. I thank the Emir of Qatar and the all organizers for this. On long-term consequences, Mark, I'll try to say what I believe it could be, but at the same time, let me say a few words about how I see it from the perspective of a country in which neighborhood there is war. There is war underway as we speak, literally a few hundred meters from the borders of my country, of Slovakia. As you have said, over the last month, almost 300,000 refugees came to Slovakia. They were welcomed. They were welcomed in Slovakia. We are struggling with that, but if the conflict persists, the burden will be unbearable for us. And this is something that we really have not expected that could happen. On a broader from a broader perspective, what consequences that will have, I have a whole list of items which I think we'll be seeing in a future, not knowing, however, what the end game of this war will be. First, let me put it very bluntly, Russia is destroying the whole European security architecture that cannot be without long-term consequences. Number two, we will see in transatlantic area a stronger NATO. This is what's happening, unfortunately, through a tragedy, is a boost to NATO, to collective defense. There will be increase of defense expenditures. We have seen that announcement by Germany, for example, 100 billion euros will be added to defense capabilities of Germany. We will see NATO more present on the eastern flank, where in each and every country, starting from the very north, in the Baltic countries, all the way through Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania and Bulgaria, NATO will be present. And we have deployed forces there to strengthen our defense. You'll see countries like Finland and Sweden considering NATO membership, or if you want, other ways of ensuring their defense guarantees. Ukraine is definitely becoming part of political West for me. So it's not that tomorrow Ukraine will become a member of European Union, for example, but politically I think this was a watershed moment in their own perspective where the country belongs, definitely to the West. I hope this will boost European foreign policy to make it more effective. And last but not least, so that I don't take too much time at the beginning, of course, a structural change in form of decoupling European Union's heavy dependency on Russian energy deliveries. In case of my country, of Slovakia, at this moment, We depend 100% on Russian oil, 85% on Russian gas. And I'm here in Qatar as well to talk to Qatari representatives about alternative deliveries that could come from this country in form of LNG. I'm saying that very transparently. But the decoupling in this area, in this area is not an if, but it's how to achieve it and ensure a sustainable deliveries and stop the weaponization of energy deliveries.
Thank you very much. Buya, can I ask you the same question?
So I think the Russian invasion, and not a very successful one, seen from Kremlin side, at least so far, shows that it does come with a huge cost to be breaking with international law and also with the UN Charter. Russia has probably lost more soldiers in 4 weeks in Ukraine than the US lost in Afghanistan and Iraq over 2 decades. We see that also Kremlin now is changing a bit of the approach, saying that they will focus though on Donbass in the weeks to come. I think many people globally also have been surprised by how strong the reactions have been from Europe and from US and the rest of the world, and a big majority in the General Assembly condemning breaking the territorial integrity of another country. So I think this is sending also a very strong message for others that would have ideas about not sticking to the UN Charter in the future, that comes with huge costs. We also know that over time, a country's influence and prosperity is very much correlated to economic success. For Russia, this is going to be a major blow to their economy, to entrepreneurship, innovation. As the minister just underlined, Russia was a major energy contributor to Europe. 40% of the natural gas in Europe came from Russia, and then many European countries even wanted to increase that reliance on Russia as an energy contributor. I think in hindsight we see that putting all the eggs in one basket like that wasn't the wisest thing. I know we're going to short-term, medium-term pay a price for that. No, there's going to be freedom fuels in Europe. Freedom fuels are renewables, but of course we also have to bridge this now with natural gas. My own country, Norway, is contributing 20% of the natural gas to Europe, and of course willing to also step up. But there are, of course, short-term limitations due to capacities on pipes and also on capacity of an LNG part in Europe. So I think that what we will see in the years to come, as also you were alluding to, Mark, and also in your book, that there is going to be a much more turbulent world, but hopefully not leading to a total decoupling between the G2, because that is going to shave off a lot of global growth in the years to come, and shaving off all that global growth also will lead to more poverty and a less prosperous world. Let's not forget that this disputed globalization has led to the doubling of the global GDP in 3 decades. We have reduced the amount of people living in extreme poverty in 3 decades from more than 40% to 10% at the same time as the global population has increased from 5 billion people to 8 billion people. Give me a recipe that could have created this kind of growth. Of course, there are inequalities, but inequalities can also be fought by domestic tools like taxes and etc. So you cannot blame globalization per se, because you haven't used the tools that are necessary to, of course, also secure inclusive growth. A lot at stake, but hopefully many countries have now learned a lesson from the Ukraine situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hina, how do you see things?
Differently, for sure. So it's interesting because when Brenda says this, I'm thinking in my head, who has been at the forefront of trying to decouple the world in many ways, even in its reaction to an emerging China? And it feels like where the West was taking steps in encouraging the world towards globalization, now in the last few years, it is the West which seems to be very keen on decoupling the world, which is quite the opposite of globalization. And all of that emanates from this fear of an emerging power, which may threaten an existing power, is the broad analysis, right? And now we can come to the more uninteresting, because your specific question was that what will be the impact? And the impact will be immense. I think it is clear that every time before this, and there was this mention of the UN Charter, so it's very interesting because when you are viewing the West from the outside, many of the claims that are made do not hold the test of time or critical analysis, okay? Because the UN, I believe, has been marginalized in many ways because of some of the adventures, some of the military interventions which were done in the past, which did not go through the proper procedure of the UN. And now it becomes problematic because obviously it is no more, the type of vehicle that can be used for better things. But in terms of the impact of this particular crisis, I think the impact is going to be far more than anything else that we've ever witnessed in any other military intervention, or there is obviously going to be an increase in military spending across the board, because fear is a very, very important, and most of the European countries, I think, will obviously do that. There will be an immense impact on the global economy, which we've already seen. There will be an immense impact on the European economy, which is perhaps something that other military sort of interventions of sorts have not done. Now, sanctions, interestingly, have both intended consequences and unintended consequences. Now, the interesting part is that much of the sanction regime that was followed prior to this, even the one on Iran, did not have direct consequences on the global economy or on, too many on the West. This one will. It will have an immediate impact on countries like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, for instance, which depend on Russia for up to 30% of their remittances. So the consequences are both going to be at the regional level, at the European level, and certainly at the global level. We're already seeing the agriculture market being massively affected. We've seen the energy market being massively affected. Some of the good that may come out of it is less dependence on fossil fuels and perhaps, assist us in the overall climate change, So eventually, I think this is not going to be a costless exercise. I believe, and I just want to end by saying this, that many of the military interventions of the past 2 decades have been almost costless to the West and have had great consequences for the area around it. So both intended and unintended consequences were only faced by the region where those interventions were done. This is going to be different. And this is perhaps going to lead to the decoupling of the world. And my fear is that if this decoupling is only with Russia, we are perhaps looking at a retrievable decoupling. But if this decoupling also includes China and the rest, then we are probably looking at the world going on a track which will be irretrievable, in many ways.
So maybe we can go a bit deeper into these things, and maybe just while you said that, Hina, I was wondering whether you could, because we've had a lot of discussions amongst Europeans about what's going on, and in some ways, I think this feels a bit like 9/11 for Europe, in that lots of people in America said 9/11's changed the world beyond recognition, and what it really changed was America's sense of itself and its security, and because America's so bound into the world, it had enormous implications for everybody else. I think, in a way, this is a bit like a European 9/11. As Ivan was saying, I think the nature of European order after this, no matter how it ends, is going to be fundamentally different beforehand. And you've talked about some of the ways that this could impact the rest of the world through the energy markets, through sanctions, etc. But it'd be great maybe to just go a bit deeper on that, because on the one hand, Boya talked about the UN General Assembly, 141 countries condemning it. At the same time, when you talk to Russians, they say, but a majority of the world's population is represented by governments that didn't condemn what we're doing. There's a big debate about whether this is about Russia versus the West or whether it's Russia versus the rest. And that is quite fundamental, I think, to how this is going to be framed. Can you maybe tell us whether you think it's about Russia versus the West, or whether this invasion is something which, you know, as a sort of post-colonial war, is something which could shock a lot of the rest of the world into both wanting to respond and also feeling that it's important that this gets resolved in the right way for global order?
Okay, yeah, so you see, I think the difference over there is, why is this not, in my view, Russia versus the rest, and is only Russia versus the West? In my view, there is only one determining factor for that and one reason for that, and that is that when the West operates within its own borders, it operates in a very different way. When it operates outside of its borders, it operates in a very different way. So many of the value system that the West proposes as reasons for, you know, the rivalry with Russia, and of course, you know, I'm not at all seeing that even a country like Pakistan cannot be for invasions or for, you know, going and getting other territories based on, without sort of justification, which is from the global architecture, which is UN. But why countries like us and the rest, as you may call it, do not view it as a fight between good and evil is because we have seen evil on our streets and in our plains and in our geography because of the wars that have been conducted post 9/11 and perhaps prior to that. So the value system that the West espouses for citizens which are Western citizens within its own countries, it's very different when the same value system is not espoused when the wars are conducted, and the right of life, human dignity, human values. The way drone strikes were conducted without authorization, without international law being supportive of it. Now we know, because of literature which has come from the cost of war studies of the of the Watson Institute of the Brown University, which is an American institute, obviously, that about 90% of people who were killed with drone strikes were actually civilians who had nothing to do with the active war. So all of this has repercussions. We also know that 929,000 people died post 9/11 wars. These are large numbers. We also know that 38 million to 60 million people have been made refugees or displaced post 9/11 wars. So the good versus evil is not as clear to me from my vantage point as it is perhaps when it is professed. And therefore this inability of the rest to buy what the narrative which is currently being given in some ways, right? Because it's like, oh, we do no wrong, but yes, they have done wrong, but you also did many wrongs, is pretty much the approach. And so if one can get away with wrong, maybe the other. And I just want to end by saying that eventually, you know, whatever comes out of it, I think it's important to know that we are today living in a world where whatever we may pretend, the truth will eventually come out, right? The truth of the post 9/11 wars is something which has, in many ways, taken away the credibility of Western democracies and the value system that is being professed. Okay, we saw through Al-Ghraib, we saw through Guantanamo Bay, we saw through how these wars were conducted, left a deep, deep dent on the reputation of the West.
What would you say to that, Ivan? Because you're involved in diplomacy, trying to get other countries to support not just the sanctions, but...
Yeah. Well, fascinating angle from which my Pakistani colleague has embraced this issue from a more global perspective, but you would understand me being foreign minister of a country which is now confronted with this conflict. I'm looking at the world from February 24th from this perspective, that we overnight feel directly threatened. And from a very narrow perspective, Mark, I'm using the title of your book, I wish there was unpeace instead of hot war in my neighborhood. But I understand everybody in the world who suffered in this world of unpeace, which you're rightly connecting, so rightly describing. Whatever you say, whether it's Russia against the West, it's Russia against the rest, from our perspective, what happened cannot be tolerated. It cannot be tolerated. Because if country A says that country B, its direct neighbor, has no right to exist, if it is questioned that Ukrainians are nations, if they start saying that there is genocide and as legitimizing the military intervention, and they only start to speak about genocide on the very day when there is intervention, because that's the case. This is threatening the whole order. As I've said, the security architecture is being destroyed as we speak. And remember, Russia has in December, November put on the table their conditions, so to say, for a deal. And they've been using this notion of indivisibility of security, which is enshrined in many documents, including in the OSCE charters and all the frameworks. But you cannot ensure indivisibility of security by threatening somebody and using force against any other nation. This is not acceptable, and therefore that I'll wrap up my intervention with that. Because it is not tolerable, the European Union and the West has responded with this unprecedented package of sanctions. However, we have to admit that we have not prevented Russia from this invasion. Nevertheless, the sanctions are targeting now the Russian ability to fund and continue with this military operation, because it is unacceptable. And yesterday, for example, there was just a few hundred kilometers from our border, from Polish border, where American President Joe Biden was, and there were rockets hit on the city of Lviv. So what is the most important issue at this moment is to stop this escalation, because you cannot control really developments if they continue as we've seen in the first month of this invasion. But once again, I wish there was unpeace. From the perspective of my country, there was unpeace instead of war at this moment.
Thank you very much. So, Boya, you were incredibly passionate in your defense of globalization and all the advances that we've had over the last generation. How do you think that it's possible to sustain some of those powerful forces which have done so much to advance prosperity, technology, and all of the other things which we've won over the last few decades in the face of great power competition, sanctions, and all these other attempts to divide and to decouple rather than to bring the world together?
Well, thank you for that question. I'm just going to add to this question about Russia. My view is it's Russia against agreed international law. So accepting other countries' territorial integrity is the basis also of cooperation between sovereign countries. And it is not that those borders are disputed. By the Budapest Agreement from 1994, it was clearly agreed, the borders of Ukraine, when they handed over the third largest nuclear capacity in the world to Russia. I think we are embarking on much more unpredictability and also power competition in the years to come. But are we even in a situation where we see this competition between G2, the two largest economies in the world, close to 50% of the global GDP? Are we still able to keep the basis for what has been the growth engine of the world, that we all compete, but the competition is based on rules, multilateral rules agreed in the World Trade Organization, but also rules that lead to us being able to use the comparative advantages of each economy to then prosper the world. So it is not about like beggar thy neighbor, it should be about prosper your neighbor. And it is a fact that it has been a win-win solution. That's why, as I mentioned, we haven't seen this low level of extreme poverty in the history of our planet. But a lot is now at stake. If we go towards a world with more protectionism, less cooperation, it's also going to lead to less prosperity, and is going to lead to a world that is not developing in a positive way. So I do believe and hope that even in this kind of confrontational situation, there will be areas where the big trading blocks of the world can continue to trade and to also keep the basis of today's cooperation. But I think the jury is out on that one.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. At the European Council on Foreign Relations, we've been trying to map some of these new terrains in which geopolitics is playing out, and we produced a power atlas, which we're constantly updating at the moment. I think it's too early to like Joe and Lai allegedly said about the French Revolution, it's certainly too early to work out what the long-term impact of this situation, this horrible war in Ukraine is going to be for global order. But I think that all of the speakers have given us an amazing glance into their crystal balls and have shown that we will be talking about this for many Doha forums to come. Maybe you can join me in thanking them for giving us such a great perspective on the global order.